Thank you, Petra. Yes, I feel I don't have to add anything tonight to what was shared in those testimonies already. Like, weren't they incredible? So much. I was like, maybe the preschool could actually come up and they could preach. And if all they need to do is step out in faith and people's hearts are moved to tears with that, just that step, then, hey, give them the microphone and they can come up here. As well as thinking of this jacket a little bit, this has nothing to do with what we'll talk about, but if at any point in your life you get married, and you know, Paul is pretty open about marriage, like some people will and some people may not, and that's all good. Marry a right person, that's number one, and number two is wear something that you will continue to wear after the wedding, because you invest a lot of finances in that day, and it's good to be able to walk away with something that you can keep using afterwards. So that's my little bit of wedding advice. I was just thinking that as I was sitting there, but yes, I have sought the Lord, Petra, correct, but it may not give you a lot of confidence to know I only got like one really small thing. So we'll see where we go. But I was really asking the Lord, and I felt him say this phrase, which will not make sense at the beginning, but hopefully as you go along it will. And it was, don't make friends with giants. And this is the application of, okay, what are the things in our life that we actually make friends with and we allow in our life? And looking at, okay, the people of Israel, children of Israel, who did they make friends with in their journey, and what was the consequences in their life? Because actually, we're called to overcome. And that is the Christian message. It's not special people. It's not just a few chosen people, but all of us are called to overcome. And when we hear that word, it sounds like a magical word, like the magical disappearance of those balls. I remember when I was, youth group days, or maybe end of youth group days, like late 90s. This is how we overcome. That song, and everybody would dance, the hands were up. This is how we overcome. But it didn't really help me the next day to know how did I actually need to overcome in my life. It was a great song, the days of choreographed dance. I'm sure we had a dance to it as well, but this idea of this is how we overcome, like, is dancing overcoming? Like, maybe sometimes, for me, dancing isn't overcoming, it's overcoming different aspects of my life, but it doesn't overcome maybe the things that I've faced in my life of insecurities or rejection or fear or isolation or loneliness. But actually, Jesus overcame, and he calls us to overcome. And you have to overcome. It's not actually a choice. And you don't overcome to arrive somewhere at a magical place of peace and tranquility. And sometimes that's our idea of overcoming. But that's actually a Buddhist worldview, right? That we overcome to actually take away the challenges and the struggles. As Christians, we overcome to overcome something else. To overcome something else, to overcome something else, because God is creating authority in our life. And through our choices, we increase in our capacity. And as we increase in authority, we increase in influence. And why that matters is because of these testimonies that were up the front. That all of those people, I know them to different degrees, but I know that they overcome and they have overcome things in their life. So when they share with people about Jesus, they actually have authority to invite people into relationship with him. And as we go to nations, we need to have authority to invite nations to respond to God. Because if we're not overcoming hopelessness and despair in our life, how can we call nations that are living in poverty, where their actual worldview is one of hopelessness? If we aren't overcoming areas of fear in our life, how can we go to nations like India and Nepal, where their whole religious system institutionalizes fear and traps 1 billion people in fear? So our authority to call people to Jesus It's not just the words that we say. It's not just the content and the truth and the information of the gospel, but we carry spiritual authority to the degree that we have overcome these things in our life. So as we overcome fear, we can step in to nations that are held bondage by fear. So I'm just going to ask Misha to put up a little thing from Hebrews chapter 12. So this is a bit of a verse. I'm going to read it out. So it's Hebrews 12, verses 3 to 13, crucially coming after Hebrews 11, which we'll reference later. Consider him who endured from sinners and hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastises every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Beside this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them. But he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who've been trained by it. Crucial verses coming up, which we'll come back to. Therefore, lift your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees, and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. Awesome. Lift your drooping hands. Pretty straight language there. The writer of Hebrews, the anonymous writer of Hebrews, different theories abound. But we're not talking about consequences of sin. Like that's not what I mean when I'm going to be talking about difficulties and challenges and things that come against us. Not consequences of sin. We know the response to that. That's repentance and walking in holiness. And I'm not talking about distractions. We know the response to that. Get over your laziness. Get active. Get involved. But talking about challenges that maybe in our life we face. Some of those things would be relational, could be financial, could be emotional. They could be things that are close and present to us or far away. They could be things that are once-off situations and things that we have to respond to. Or they could be familiar things that we have to battle. They could be times of sustained like resistance or opposition or things that we think come against us. And there could be, different expressions of that in our life. The issue isn't what we face. The issue is how do we respond to it. It's not a question of comparison to say, well, actually, you don't know what I've been through. No, I don't, but you don't know what I've been through. And I don't know what someone else has been through. But we have the same call and command and the same invitation and the same empowering spirit. And those challenges may look different culturally. They may look different generationally. For many people around the world, as they follow Jesus, their actual reality is one of physical danger. I was just meeting with a group of people last week, and they were telling stories of different people in YWAM in another continent who there had been guns pointed at the heads of the fathers in front of the children, and how many YWAM workers had actually died already this year through different things, some through conflict, some through accident. And it was like, hey, that's a very present reality in their life. So for us, maybe that's not our reality, but we face things that come against us. The question is, what actually comes against you to wear down your resolve to love and to obey God? What are those things that actually pull us back? Or what are those things that actually cause us to step back in faith from what God calls us to? And those challenges, they differ over time. I remember when I first joined staff here at YWAM Perth, my first job was to send a bunch of promotional material that we had used to have a lot more of, up to Canada to a missions conference. And I was like, this is my job. Got the address, put them in an envelope, sent them off. A couple weeks later, I get this phone call from Canada. This person from the missions conference, like, hey, apparently your package has arrived in Canada, but you have to pay some kind of like customs, some kind of import duty. I was like, what? On like pieces of paper. And so you have to pay like another $100 and something in order to get your leaflets to our missions expo. I was like sitting on the toilet crying. I was like, I have like completely wrecked YWAM Perth. Like I've done like $100. Like we're gonna go bankrupt. And I was like, how am I ever gonna go into accounts and tell them like we owe these people another $100? And I was sitting there, I was like, I don't know what to do. I was literally, this is my first job and I have failed. I've failed at like sending like DTS brochures to another country. And I actually just thought of that like a few weeks ago. Like I don't live in that moment, but I remembered it. And I was like, I remember that emotion. But I've never cried about DTS brochures again. But probably that same scenario has been expressed in different ways over the years, ever since then. Different levels, different challenges, different traumas, different temptations, different opposition, different accusations, different threats. And I would say, okay, I actually have faced the temptation to go to the same places of hopelessness and of despair. And some of those times I've won those battles. Some of those times have been very private. Some of those times have been very public. There's other times I'm like, okay, I actually go full circle and come back around to those things. So our battles, okay, that's a really funny example, but I've faced the same things in different times. Hey, you gotta step up and do this for the first time, or you're asked to take on this responsibility for the first time, or actually I've encountered the first time someone really doesn't like me, or the first time someone really doesn't like me with a lot of intensity, or a lot of accusation, or a lot of challenge. And we face those same battles and they get replicated time and time and time again. But that's actually the opportunity to trust God. And that's what develops spiritual resolve in us. And the significance isn't I'm just becoming a better person. Like if we think that and we internalize, then actually we've lost the context that God is training us for authority. And God is shaping us, and our response to the challenge determines what authority are we going to carry into the nations. And so it's like, what does the enemy use to actually wear me down? Is it discouragement? Is it isolation? Is it loneliness? Is it rejection? Is it opposition? Is it relational challenges? Is it my lack of being recognized? Do I feel I'm being held back by a particular leader or a person? What is an answer I'm expecting God to do in a particular time or a particular way? What are my irritations? What are the things that I expect? And our obedience can become dependent on outcomes. And I was reflecting on this a little bit of last week. I was hanging out with some of my heroes, and there's one particular guy. I'm like, he's my hero, and I was telling someone, I was like, don't want him to know, but I kind of want him to know that I think he's my hero. And he's like, that like probably like 50 other guys in the room, like they think the same thing. And I'm like, okay, you can tell him. And he got up and shared, and he's pioneered a particular YWAM work in a nation, and he's been there like 5 years, 6 years. And he was like, we were there and we moved there. And for the first 3 years, I would just pray to God, please God, do not send anybody to join me. I'm so embarrassed. I'm so ashamed that it's just me and my wife and one person, and nothing has happened. And nothing is taking place. Nothing is happening. Nothing's going on. I'm so embarrassed, and I would pray, God, send no one. Please do not let my friends come and see me like this. And through that time that God stripped him of all ambition and all sense of self. 3 years fast forward, he's flourishing work, 40 to 50 people through his choices of overcoming. And it made me start to think about, okay, we think about Hebrews 11, and, we encourage ourselves by looking at this list of people who've done great exploits. And by faith, this person did this. By faith, this person did that. And by faith, this person achieved something. And then it goes on, and it shifts from actually naming people to the unnamed ones. And it talks about what they suffered. And okay, we're not saying this to compare and think about our reality in that sense, but it talks about what they went through. And none of these people are named. They don't actually have a record of who they were, but it says all of these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us they should not be made perfect. So the principle there is like their obedience wasn't dependent on the outcome. And they never actually saw the outcome of what was promised. They never actually saw the outcome even of what they believed God had said to take place in their life or in their lifetime. But they didn't waver in their faith. They actually continued to trust God. So the test isn't that we're spectacular. The test isn't, do I get my name on the list? Am I named specifically for what I have achieved? But the test is, will I be faithful? In my battle, in my present reality, the things that come against me, will I be faithful? And, half the chapter, they're named. We look to them, we draw courage from them, we're encouraged by them, we see what they have achieved, but yet, the second half, these people, they don't have names. There's no list of who they were, but they stayed faithful. And that's our challenge. So overcoming is not this magical word, but it means I don't shift in my choice. I don't shift in my resolve. I don't shift in my commitment to truth, no matter what my circumstance is. Because circumstances will speak a particular thing, but truth is a person. And truth is knowable, and Jesus is knowable. I heard this quote last week. It may not be theologically correct, so you can write messages to the MC. You need the battle more than the battle needs you. That actually, we need the battle to develop muscle in our life and spiritual authority in our life, and to learn how to overcome. We are actually a part of a broad picture of the battle. God does relationship with us. God uses us to advance his kingdom, but actually we need the battle. We need the challenges. We need the things that come against us to develop faith and to develop trust in God and to strengthen ourselves. Because sometimes our theology is, okay, actually, comfort and convenience means that I'm in the right place. Or comfort and convenience is the best place to know and to experience God. But actually, walk in the ways of comfort and convenience, we don't overcome. I'm going to read a little bit from Jeremiah. Jeremiah 12. I really like this because it has to do with horses. I love horses. So I've always remembered this. So Jerry had a real complaint. Like, there are people who wanted to kill him. It says in the last few verses of chapter 11, okay, God is talking to him about people who wanted to kill him. So he had a real complaint. Sounds like a song. If you're from my era. Righteous are you, O Lord, when I complain to you, yet I would not plead my case before you. So he's saying, I know you're righteous, God, but I'm going to give it a go anyway. I'm going to try anyway to get my complaint in there. Why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why do all who are treacherous thrive? You plant them and they take root. They grow and produce fruit. You are near in their mouth and far from their hearts. His complaint against God is that God is unfair, that the wicked are prospering. So I know you're righteous, but I got a question for you. But you, O Lord, know me, you see me, and test my heart towards you. Pull them out like sheep for the slaughter, and set them apart for the day of slaughter. So then he's telling God what to do. How long will the land mourn and the grass of every field wither? For the evil of those who dwell in it, the beasts and the birds are swept away, because they said, he will not see our latter end. The Lord answers Jeremiah, because God is good to speak to us. So there's Jerry. People have come against me. I'm doing the right thing. I'm doing the right thing. I'm prophesying what God has told me to do. People want to kill me. God, you're good, but have you noticed this? Have you considered this? I think it's a little bit unfair. The Lord answers Jeremiah, if you have raced with men on foot and they have wearied you, how will you compete with horses? And if in a safe land you are so trusting, what will you do in the thicket of the Jordan? And we look at him, we're like, hey, that's pretty justified that he would feel pretty overwhelmed. He had people threatening to kill his life. They're threatening to take his life. And so I think it'd be pretty justified in that situation that he has a just cause of complaint. And then God actually comes and confronts him and is like, it's kind of like, bro, is that all you got? Like, is this all you've got? Come on. There's greater purpose. There's purpose in this process. And right now, we're only running. You know, like right now, it's like you're running against people, but I'm training you to run against horses. And that's, you know, jump on the horse, Jerry. But that's actually God's ways in our life, is that he trains us and we run against people. And this is this language. Like, okay, we have our battles, we have our challenges, we have our opposition, we have the things that come against us in our life, the things that we familiar maybe cycle back to again and again and again, or areas of opposition or areas of restriction, of limitation that we are aware of in our life. And God says, okay, if you've raced with people on foot and you've been worn out, how can you race against horses? There's greater purpose, there's greater context. He was being called to prophesy to the nation and to stand and to call people back to him. And that's our life as well. It's not just for this personal sense of, I need to overcome to escape pressure. I'm not overcoming to escape a challenge and uncomfortability. I'm actually overcoming because it matters for the nations. It matters that I carry authority. It matters that I don't just go and say the right thing or do the right thing, but it matters that I do that with authority because I have overcome. And we know the context is that God is not unjust. Again, in Hebrews, in the same book that we've been looking at, God actually is presented as God is not unjust. He does not overlook what you have done. And that can be our complaint. Hey, God, I'm doing this by myself. Or do I have to overcome within my own strength? Are you aware? Do you notice? God is not unjust. God is not unfair. God is not ignorant of your situation or your condition, but he says, hey, I am present and I empower you, but hey, we got a job to do. And sometimes that's what we need, is people to come along and say, hey, I hear you, I stand with you, I care with you, but we need to overcome. We need to overcome because this isn't the level of the limitation of your life that God has called you to. See, for the Israelites, they were actually engaged in real physical warfare. And there were generations of them making friends with their enemies. And that actually led them astray. And that led them into idolatry, and it led them into immorality. And it meant that they looked like the nations that they were meant to present God to. The people of Israel were meant to present God to the nations around them. And one of the key things was they were meant to show that God was faithful. And so in their unfaithfulness, they weren't able to do that. So in areas that we're unfaithful in our life, we don't actually present God to people, to the nations. But we become like them. And we're like, okay, maybe it's not engaged in idolatry in the same way, but where we aren't actually living in faith and living in holiness, we become like those that we're supposed to present God to. There's actually some really key verses in Judges where it talks about, okay, there are armies that they made friends with, they made different treaties and truces and stuff, but it also says that there are armies that were left to teach the Israelites how to fight, for successive generations to actually know the ways of warfare. And sometimes in our life, it's like, okay, I feel like I've gone through this before, but actually God is taking you deeper. And he gets you deeper to motivations, or deeper to actually the reason why, or the roots of things. And there's things that are in our life that may be there to actually build appropriate pressure and to teach us how to fight. And there's things even practically and physically that may come against us, that it's easy to say, it feels hard, so it mustn't be God. But actually, there's things that are there to teach us how to fight. They're there to teach us how to trust. They're there to teach us how to hear God. Because what we're called to do is to overcome these things. And it teaches us dependence. So if we look at the Israelites, okay, we have to understand, okay, what are areas that I've made friends with these giants, or I've given allowance to. I've allowed myself in my mind, in my emotions, to accept that this is okay, to tolerate this responses, to not be in faith, to accept that this is just how I am, or what will take place, or this is my reading of this situation, or what I'm in faith for. And we also need to recognize, hey, there's areas that are in our life to teach us how to fight, to teach us how to be desperate, to teach us how to believe, to teach us how to actually come to God and say, hey, I need you. I can't do this in my own strength. And that's where the Israelites were in peace. That's often where they went. Where everything was easy, that's the way they went. They went to idolatry. They went to immorality. Too much free time, or maybe too much spare emotion, because they didn't actually have to trust for anything greater than themselves. But we're called to trust for more than ourselves. And Jesus didn't promise the way of easiness. He actually promised the opposite. Sometimes it's easy to think, okay, Jesus didn't promise an easy life. And we're like, okay, I know that. I understand that. But it's another level to go to, that Jesus actually promised challenge. He actually promised difficulty. He used the word trials or tribulations or suffering. But he said, I will be with you, that I'm actually with you in this. And that's the question of like, hey, is he who we go to? Is he the one that we go to? Do we look within ourselves to see what's there? Or do we actually go to him? Okay, Jesus, we actually need to know you, that you're present with us. Things that look impossible, or things that look challenging, or like, okay, actually the question isn't what do I face? So it's not a question of comparison, but the question is, do I respond in faith? And Jesus told a parable, which we won't kind of look at, but of the widow who goes to the unjust judge. And the point isn't, they're not saying that God is like the unjust judge. It's comparing, okay, in this situation, even an unjust judge responded. How will God respond, and what he will be like? But the question was, will the Son of Man find faith? When he comes, will he find faith? Not positional faith of just, I believe that is true, but will he find faith that has overcome? So if we go back to Hebrews and like, okay, this is it. There's no formula for how to overcome, but it's more just an exhortation that you have to overcome. You actually have to overcome. That takes into account, maybe for some of us, we need close accountability, we need closer relationship, we need different environment, and at times specialized attention into that. I take all of that into account. But to say, actually, our hope has to be fixed, that I can overcome, that I will not be overcome. I am not going to be overcome by the things that come against me. So if we say, okay, lift your drooping hands, then that is a faith resolve. That is us, that is my choice. I lift my drooping hands, where I recognize in my spirit, I fellowship with discouragement. I fellowship with lowness of spirit. I fellowship with this sense of being overwhelmed. And that is the drooping hands. He's like, hey, you actually have to pick that up. That's not something that someone else is going to do for you. It's not, I need the right answer from somebody, or another conversation, or give me a solution. It's like, okay, what is drooping in your spirit? You actually have to lift that up. That is an instruction to lift that up. So when we're talking about these verses, it's following on a command of taking on disciplines, taking on input, and living in holiness. So that's in the back, that's in the framework. That's my assumption. We're taking on the right input and discipline, and we're as well living in holiness. But this question is more a question of the Spirit. Okay, lift your drooping hands. That's something that you actually need to resolve in your spirit. This is it. And it's like, on the phone, you have like something that can lock. You can lock onto airplane mode when you jump on a plane. But we have those switches where we can we lock it on, but then we can lock it off again. It's locked on until something happens, until I get off this plane, then I can switch it back off. But actually, it's saying, okay, this faith resolve is something that I flick in my spirit that's actually locked on to truth. It locks on to this is who God is. Strengthen your weak knees. Apply yourself. Don't quit. Jesus isn't just an inspirational figure. Hey, he empowers us. Sometimes I think, man, I didn't get to quit. People didn't let me quit, so don't quit. That's just the advice I have. Don't quit. Strengthen your weak knees. I work with a lot of people who go through our programs, and I stay in touch with many of them. And sometimes the stories are, I was really lonely for a few days, so then I made this choice, or for a few weeks, or for a few months. But I also hear the stories years down the track of you just keep going. You just keep choosing. You just keep saying yes to Jesus. Okay, you made a mistake. You get up the next morning. You have a quiet time. You come back to God. You seek him. You know him. It's possible. It's not reserved for a few people. Strengthen your weak knees. And I think within that, okay, we strengthen ourselves in God. We strengthen ourselves in the consistency of coming back to him, of knowing him. I know this is stuff that we all know and we all hear all of the time, but we lock in on it. We strengthen our weak knees. Make straight paths. Walk in the fear of the Lord. Set boundaries in our life. And then I think this was just the thing that I felt the Lord want to kind of highlight a little bit. So that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but healed. And I think that's God's tenderness and his care in our life, to recognize, there are actually vulnerabilities in our life. And there's things that maybe we face that really afflict us, that really might torment us or harass us, or things that we feel, okay, I actually don't know if I have the faith to actually see freedom from these things. And I feel God's saying that that's what these words are about. Okay, he recognizes and he understands. But if we put those things, if we lift our drooping hands, if we actually lock into faith, and we strengthen our knees and we make straight our paths, then those vulnerabilities and those things that can trip us up, they actually won't. Because then there's faith that they can be healed. But those are the things that if we're not doing the other stuff, that is what will come out of joint. And I know that, and I recognize that in my life. There's things that I continually will have to confront and have to face. And some of those things have to do with fears. Some of those things have to do with insecurity. Some of those things have to do with, just big issues of leadership and identity and all that. And that never actually goes away. And those insecurities, and that's not to discourage, but that's actually to encourage. Those things actually I've found have never gone away. But I overcome them at one level, and then I have to face them at another. And I have to overcome them at that level to then step into greater influence or greater responsibility. But if I'm not doing those three things, those are the things that come out of joint. Those are the things that overwhelm me. Those are the things that bring affliction in my spirit or discouragement in my heart. Those are the things that say, hey, I can't actually do that, or I can't overcome that, or I can't choose that, because they're there. And God is aware of those things. And they're there for me to trust him, and they're there for me to grow in greater dependence. They're there for me to grow in faith and to hear him. But those things that, hey, those are the things that they can come out of joint if I'm not actually doing those other things. If I'm not following the instruction that is actually given to me that is possible. It's possible. It is possible to lift our spirit. It is possible to find courage in God. And just to finish, the context to me, I just read a book on Paul. I love Paul. And as you read Paul, like, man, he makes such great statements of truth about who Jesus is. And he's presenting Jesus to the church. And he is establishing so much of our understanding of God. But he's so candid, he's so personal, he's so open, he's so real about his sufferings. He's so real about the concern he feels, and he talks about the anxiety he feels for the church. Like, was this in vain? Did I do all of this for nothing? Was there purpose in it? I've done all of this. And you read like his passion and plea and appeal to the churches to follow God. And he does all this. He talks about his failures. He talks about his suffering. He's so honest about the internal. But the context was because of the churches, because of others. I have walked through suffering. I have walked through pain. I have done all of this to present Jesus to people. And that's why it matters. It matters not just when we're sitting in a room. It matters not just in a worship time, but it matters to actually overcome these things. It matters to face fears. It matters to confront giants in our spirit, in our mind, in our life, where we say, this is how far I can go, but I always kind of get stuck here. Actually, God wants to release faith to get through those things, to overcome those things, because we're called to carry authority in the nations. And in suffering, we identify with Jesus. That's, again, in Hebrews, consider Jesus. Consider Jesus. Not just an inspirational hero, not just Jesus who takes away my sins, Jesus who walked through suffering, Jesus who overcame, for what was set before him, for the hope of people being redeemed with God. And that is our hope as well. And that is our purpose. Our purpose has to be so much more than self-improvement, than self-management, than self-fulfillment, than discovering our sense of identity within ourselves. But it's found in him, and it's found in hope. And as we overcome, then we gain authority to call people to him. And that's what's on his heart. And that's why it matters. It matters the things that you face. God knows. God really, 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 really cares. But just as he did with Jeremiah, he says, hey, come on. There's greater purpose. Hey, come on, trust for more. Hey, come on, that's not actually the limit of where we're going to. There's more at stake. So I'm going to hand it back to Petra. But yeah, just really draw courage as we look to God, hey? That there's purpose in our overcoming. There's purpose in actually considering Jesus, in identifying with him. The example of Paul, and we look and we see the nations that they need to know Jesus. And as we go out, we can go out with authority to call them to him.
Great. Thanks, Quenton. The worship team can come up. I just felt to kind of read a little bit of what Quenton was referring to in Hebrews 11. I think, as Q said, we know the stories of the people that are named, but then there's a whole list of the unnamed people that didn't necessarily see the fulfillment of the promise that they were holding on to. And it's in Hebrews 11, and it starts in verse 35. It says, there were others. So at first you've got the whole list of victories and things like battles that they saw the victory of it. And then it shifts and said there were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskin and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us. And this is where it shifts, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. And then it goes to Hebrews 12, which I think we all kind of know these verses, and we often talk about it. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. And then it carries on, and we read that earlier. And as Quenton was sharing, I was just thinking about this, like these heroes that it says, like the great cloud of witnesses that overcame. Even though they didn't see the victory, they overcame because they didn't give up. And that through this, the writer of Hebrews is basically inviting us into this and saying, this is us. We are still running this race. Let us not give up because of that and because of who Jesus is. And I feel like there might be areas in our lives, or I feel the question that came up as Quenton was sharing was, what are battles that we have given up on? That we feel like, I'm not going to overcome that anyways. And as Quenton was sharing, that God is calling us to really plant our feet and saying, this battle is bigger than me, but God, I trust you. I trust in your faithfulness. I trust in your strength. I trust in your care. As Quenton just finished up with that, God really, really cares about us, but he's calling us to something greater. And I believe that there might be areas in our lives that we feel like you've given up on. We'll never get there. And that God is actually calling us to rise and to take that back on. And there might be some of us that are taking on something new, maybe something that we're like, we're not sure about it, but that God is calling us to really take that on with strength. Not because we're the ones that can overcome in our own strength, but because God has called us. And because he is good, and because he will make a way, and because we can always fix our gaze on the author and perfecter of our faith. So what I would like to do is actually give us some time to think about it. Are there battles that I feel I've given up on? Are there areas that God is calling us to overcome that maybe we've kind of just left? Or are there areas in our lives where we haven't been fixing our gaze on God, but we've been kind of all over the place, not sure what to do, and God is calling us back to the truth of who he is, that we can overcome, and that he has something greater for us because of that. So maybe what we can do is just take a couple of minutes for us to think about that and really allow the Holy Spirit to speak to us. And trusting that there are areas where we can really, I guess, have a resolve in our hearts to say, yes, I'm taking this on, God.